to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. This is the second episode in which I'm talking to our principal, Peter Williams, about internal evidence for why we can trust the Gospels. So if you haven't seen the first or listened to the first episode in which we talk about some of those issues, you might want to just pause this and go and listen to that one first. But we're going to carry on that conversation today. So it's good to see you again such a long time later after our last conversation.
Yes. So we were just having a little conversation offline about internal arguments for the Gospels. And one of the things you said to me, Tony, was about the things that the Gospels don't say.
Yes.
So how would you unpack that argument?
It's very striking that when you read through the Gospels, one of the issues that Jesus is getting into hot water with the Pharisees and the religious authorities is over Sabbath and how he behaves on the Sabbath. They don't like the fact that the disciples are plucking ears of corn on the Sabbath and eating them. They don't like the fact that he heals people on the Sabbath. And there's this long discussion in John 5 when he heals the man at the pool of Bethesda about my Father's working to this day, and I'm working, and what's going on there? We don't like all of this kind of thing, and so there's a huge amount of Sabbath controversy. Again and again, Sabbath becomes an issue. But then once with the other side of the resurrection and the other side of Pentecost, and the church has been born with the coming of the Holy Spirit, and it's the beginning of the church. What we read in Acts is that the church started to meet on the first day of the week. So they kept the Sabbath principle as many people in the early church, of course, would have been slaves and would not have been able to take a day of rest. But they kept the Sabbath principle as much as they could, and yet they seem to have redefined that 7-day rhythm in terms of resting and meeting on the first day of the week, not the seventh day of the week. And you read through the New Testament letters and letters even from church fathers, you don't see anything about Sabbath controversies because they just redefined how they thought about it, kept the principle, but they were not concerned about the Jewish law on the Sabbath. On the other hand, when you read through the New Testament letters, you see all sorts of issues coming up in terms of how do we deal with the fact that the gospel is now going to the Gentiles, and the clean, unclean, the food laws, all those kinds of things. So Acts chapter 9, where Paul is going to Cornelius, 10, where Paul is going to Cornelius, Peter's going to Cornelius, and he's told to go willingly, not to treat him as unclean. And then there's the discussion that happens in Jerusalem as a result of that. There's a further discussion with the Council of Jerusalem. How do we deal with the Gentiles? And so the food laws that have dominated Judaism are largely put aside, or at least for the Gentiles. There's still the issue about food, meat with blood in it, but it becomes a much narrower thing. And there's also the question of circumcision there. Should Gentiles become circumcised or not? And those things simply don't come up in the Gospels. And so if this, one of the things we talked about in the last episode was these Gospels don't look like they've been written by committee. If they had been written by a committee of the early church, say 30 years on, and they were trying to add in traditions or trying to create documents that would serve their purposes rather than trying to tell the story of what actually happened, their focus would be on other issues.
Yeah.
Surely Jesus must have spoken something about circumcision at some point. Why isn't it there? Why doesn't Jesus talk about the Gentiles being included in the church? Well, because it wasn't much of an issue when he was traveling around, but it's now a very live issue for them. So that seems to me very compelling that they were the gospel writers were very deliberately, they knew about those other issues, but they're trying to record what happened.
Yeah, so I mean, it really you're saying, I think it's right, it's like archaeological layers. There's
Yeah.
the layer of the early church, the layer of the time of Jesus's ministry, and then there's what happens in early Christianity. In that early time of Jesus' ministry, Sabbath is a really big thing. In the early church, it's not, at least not in the same way.
Yeah.
Non-Jews are coming to faith. They're not Sabbath observing in that way when something like the letter to Colossians is written, or Romans. There's a sort of different attitude
Yes.
About that. So that's one very clear difference. And then there's the dog that doesn't bark. I think that's a reference to the Hounds of the Baskervilles, Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, where it's the things that don't happen in the gospel. So what you would be thinking of doing, what people later want to do, is to co-opt Jesus to your cause. Right. That's what we want to do nowadays as well.
Yes.
Won't go too far into how that happens nowadays, but the basic thing is you want to project back onto Jesus' lips. So this is what humans would naturally want to do, whatever their political leaning is, or their church leaning. And so, yes, you would want him to tell you how to run a church service. You'd want to tell him what to do with the Gentiles, what to do about circumcision, and wouldn't it be great? And the thing is, that actually happens in the fake gospels, the apocryphal gospels, in the 2nd, 3rd century. That's exactly what they do, is co-opt Jesus to be the spokesperson for whatever they want to get over. But Jesus in the 4 gospels, the earliest gospels, the authentic ones, just doesn't do that. He is absolutely teaching in a different way. He encounters a few Gentiles, and that's interesting. A centurion, a Syrophoenician woman, but overwhelmingly his ministry is to the Jews, and engaging with their issues in a way that it's quite inconceivable that people writing a long time later would want to do.
Yes.
It strikes me there's a sort of another element to it, which is that the way Jesus refers to himself, for instance, is very frequently as the Son of Man, which seems to be a reference back to Daniel chapter 7. But the thing there is, early Christians aren't calling him the Son of Man. And also what they're tending to do very soon is they're calling him not just Jesus, but Jesus Christ, or the Lord Jesus Christ, and longer reverential titles. And yet, when you've got the Gospels, it's very rare they would call him Jesus Christ. Yes, you've got it in Matthew chapter 1, arguably Mark chapter 1. But it's not the general way of speaking about him. He's spoken of as Jesus.
It's not in the flow of the narrative. It's in the introductory material in those 2 cases.
And then you might say that there's another thing. I mean, very commonly people use the argument in the resurrection that it's women at the tomb.
Right.
But again, if you were that because women's testimony was not accepted in Judaism, or not viewed at the same level, this would be, as Josephus says, this would be something that would not at all benefit the credibility of the narrative. But again, the way women are spoken of as his followers, Luke chapter 8, and so on, again, if it was the men writing the stories later, wouldn't they want to put themselves back in and say, we were the heroes? And if Simon Peter were building a power base, he wouldn't allow himself to be written of as the guy who denied Jesus several times. And all of the male disciples come out quite badly. So all of that just gives you a real sense of the layer we have in the Gospels is just different from what we have in the book of Acts and the epistles, the letters. And even though it's widely believed that the letters were written before the Gospels, I mean, it's not universally believed, but widely believed, there's nevertheless a sense that the Gospels have the earlier type of material.
Yes.
And that's just, stunning.
Yeah, it really is. It really is stunning. Just on the male disciples not coming off terribly well within the Gospels. Any thoughts on whether Mark has written himself into the Gospel with the Garden of Gethsemane, the guy who runs away without the cloak? It's an odd thing to include otherwise.
It is a very, very odd thing to include otherwise, and you wonder if that may be the case. The young man seized and has to flee naked because the garment gets taken, and yes, that could be a bit of autobiography. It certainly makes sense that John Mark seems to be from a wealthy family. Obviously, he's got a Latin name, that says Luke. He's cousin of Barnabas. We know Barnabas comes from Cyprus, but is also a Levite,
right,
who, contrary to the Old Testament law where Levites aren't allowed to own land, owns land that he can sell.
Yes.
That's all in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
It seems the early church may have met in Mark's mother's house. So it seems there's a bit of land and property going round in that grouping. So yes, it makes sense. He might have a nice garment which he lost. I mean, all those things work. You can say yes, it looks plausible, but we can't
absolutely. What it does
absolutely land that.
It does at least point to it being, again, eyewitness.
Oh, absolutely,
thing,
yeah.
That it's not simply somebody spinning stories together, because you wouldn't put those kinds of details in. Just let me go back to something you said in the last episode about there aren't signs of, I can't quite remember the adjective you use, but outrageous bias or unjustified bias. And then you were saying just now about co-opting Jesus for an agenda, because some people say that the gospel writers have all co-opted Jesus for their particular agendas, because they do all have a bias in that they want people to believe who Jesus is. Now, is that a justified bias or an unjustified bias?
Let's put the four Gospels alongside the main Jewish writer who survives in Greek from the first century, namely Josephus.
Yep.
Now, there's no doubt that Josephus comes off very well in Josephus's own account of things. And he will tell you how superbly educated he was, and how extremely noble his family was, and how well he was thought of, and how great a strategist he was in military terms. And he just happened... He's a remarkable man. And he just happened to make a deal when they were trapped by the Romans, that they would take it in turns to kill themselves off, and the last couple would kill each other off, and he just happened to be the ones that along with another guy that survived, and he just happened to make a prediction about the emperor, the future emperor, that he would be emperor, and really was yes, a stunning man. But he's saying it himself, and I don't mean to cast doubt on his credentials. He really may have been very remarkable, but we basically have his own word for it.
Yep.
And that, I think, is different from what we have, say, in John's Gospel. I mean, in John's Gospel, written, it seems, by the beloved disciple, who described himself as especially loved by Jesus, but he's not painting himself as getting everything right.
No.
He didn't believe as early as he should have done, and that's where I think there is, and he's not bragging about his own credentials and achievements. It's so much of, he felt this special love from Jesus. Didn't mean no one else had that, but
and even when he refers to himself as the beloved disciple, he's not saying me, the beloved disciple, or John, the beloved disciple. He actually is just the beloved disciple.
Yeah, so he even avoids writing
himself.
his own name in, and so I think that there is a sort of, there's a self-effacing nature to that, and again, there will be all sorts of opportunity for someone writing a book which is going to be circulated to seek to sort of, grift, I think, is the more common term nowadays, to do well out of the fact this is happening. And clearly, the early gospel writers and apostles were not grifters. So I think that's a sort of an interesting feature of the Gospels.
Yes. And if they do want to persuade people about who Jesus is, that does raise the obvious question. Why would they want to do that if Jesus was not who they believed him to be?
They're pointing to someone else. Now, we obviously can bring in other things we know from the context, that it could be quite difficult being a Christian, and there could be lethal consequences at times to that. So I think all of these things stack up together. Now, you may have a decision about where to take this conversation, but I was wondering about eyewitness details, because I think you flagged that up a bit with our young man running away. Because I think that's, again, an interesting feature, which on its own wouldn't prove historicity. And in fact, we're not using strong language like proof. We're rather looking at what's the best explanation, the best and the simple and the beautiful explanation for the Gospels as they're true. It's not a question of like, I can coerce a skeptic into believing
absolutely
these things. But I think that's something I've written about a bit with the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And there you have that comment both in Mark and in John about the grass. And that's a lovely a detail. You think, why does it's not essential to the telling of this story that anyone talks about the fact there's much grass or that there's green grass, but it's the sort of thing that does fit if you are an eyewitness. And because we happen to know that it is Passover at the time when this happens, that's according to John, and I've done a little bit of searching on weather patterns nearby. You've just had 5 of the greatest months of rain leading up to that, so the grass would be green at the time of year.
Yes.
So that's an interesting feature.
It is, and that's a striking comment anyway, because they give so few comments about the nature of the environment that they're in. They just they assume that the readers know, but in Old Testament narrative and in the Gospels, there isn't that sense of painting a scene as we would have in modern narrative. And so the fact that they do mention the grass at all is quite a striking thing.
Yes, and you've got other things, whether it's Zacchaeus in Luke 19, going up into a sycamore tree because he was small. And then you're just given a bit of a picture, not a lot, but it happens in Jericho. Jericho is the lowest city on the planet. It's got a different climate from other cities. And yes, sycamores do grow there. So when you get these sorts of plant mentions and they stack up, that's interesting. But you may also have a sort of a list of your favourite sort of eyewitness details.
The list of my favourite eyewitness details all come from your book, Peter.
Oh, really? Okay.
So we've mentioned some of them, the ones that I particularly like already.
I mean, you could say there. Just as you have the opening of the Lesson on the Mount or Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, he goes up the mountain and he sits down and teaches. And again, sometimes you find that people aren't concerned about those physical elements, but we often find with Jesus a description of where he was physically. He was sitting in a boat teaching.
Right.
Or the crowd were pressing upon him, or he was in a house and lots of people crowded around. And it's not that this is a long Tolkien-like description with filling out the entire scene so you can visualize it, but just a slight hint of the situation.
Yes.
And that's interesting. Or it'll say, it came someone kneeling or crying, and those are the sorts of features that I think can be interesting, because someone is probably not thinking, I'm going to put this descriptive detail in. It just naturally arises as they recall the event.
One that I always enjoy is almost feels like an aside almost. So at the beginning of Luke chapter 8, you've just had the account of Jesus being anointed by a sinful woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee. And then Luke says soon afterwards he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming, bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who've been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. And then he's on into the great crowd gathering, tells the parable of the sower. And I think so. It's one of those little sections that so often we just skip over because it's not Jesus teaching. It's not Jesus doing a miracle. It's just, it feels like Luke saying, and then they went on to the next place. But he gives us a little more. And when you stop and think about it, you think, that's a very interesting thing that he's dropping in there, that he knows who these people are. He knows that Joanna is connected into Herod's household. Well, that opens up all sorts of possibilities for getting information about what happened in Herod's palace at various times. But why does he mention them here? Well, perhaps because this encounter with a sinful woman that's just happened at the end of Luke 7 would raise questions in people's minds about, but surely that's just an emotional response. She's just a woman kind of thing, and it doesn't mean anything. And Luke immediately tells us there are women who are being really self-sacrificial in following Jesus around, supporting him. These are people in it for the long term, and that's then the teaching that he then tells us about is people who are demonstrating the value of their discipleship.
Yes, and then that's another thing when we think about the bandwidth of information coming from Jesus to, let's say, the Gospels, because Jesus has 12 students, 12 disciples. That's what disciple means, student. So they are supposed to learn. Obviously, Judas commits suicide, so you lose one. But then they replace him because they say in the book of Acts, we need someone who's been with us from the beginning, someone who's, if you like, studied all the courses, done the curriculum, to join in the 12s, because he doesn't just have the 12, he actually has a wider number. In fact, at one stage, he was sending out 70 disciples in pairs. So you've got Jesus going round, and you've got people who are learning from this rabbi. And then in this passage you've drawn our attention to, Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, it names Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, and many others.
Yes.
So we've got to think, well, how many is many? Obviously, it doesn't say, but you can start imagining dozens, let's say, of women who are also following. So then you've got and of course, in the book of Acts, you have 120 who are there starting things off. But in 1 Corinthians, you've got 500 who see Jesus risen from the dead, most of whom are still alive in the mid-50s when Paul is writing. So you potentially have lots of people who have heard Jesus say lots of things. So even though Luke isn't an eyewitness, and he actually says he's not, he says he has followed things closely. How many people does he have to interview? The answer is an awful lot of people. Here we are in 2025 in Cambridge. C.S. Lewis died in 1963, and I know two people who have memories of him in Cambridge. All of those years ago. So that's 62 years ago, and I can go and talk to people and get some memories. Now, Luke's Gospel is not written, I don't think, that long at all. After the ministry of Jesus, there are lots and lots of people to go and talk to about Jesus, including these women. And then Mary Magdalene, obviously Mary, we've done stuff on names in the past, how Mary is the most common Jewish woman's name in the land, and therefore it's given an extra qualification, Mary Magdalene. Then Joanna, well, naming her as connected with Herod's household, that's Herod Antipas, you can't do that if she's made up. She's a real character. So name dropping her is either she's still around or she was well known, real person who was a follower of Jesus, and in a sense authenticates this. And then Susanna is not given any further qualification, and you think she may be known to Theophilus, to whom the book is dedicated. She may be somewhat widely known. And again, so you have all these people who are authenticating what's in the Gospels. And I think what I'd say with these arguments for the reliability of the Gospels is they really are cumulative. It's not that it doesn't all depend on one sort of internal argument. There are actually several different sorts of internal arguments. We talked about eyewitnesses. We talked about the dog doesn't bark, the thing didn't bark, that things that are not said, that Jesus is not co-opted for people's agendas, or in the last episode, we talked about specific features of Jesus's stories or his one-liners in teaching. So all of these things come together. And this is just one more element to it, the sense that there is a significant number of people who can directly say, what they experienced of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah. And there are other people, aren't there, who are mentioned, just that we get one instance of their name. Just there's so many people who are then named because they're known in some way. Their names mean something to the people that Luke anticipates reading this, whether that be Theophilus or a wider group. Cleopas in Luke chapter 24 and various others, and it's all. It all fits together, doesn't it? There's all of these things that they're not knock them down, drag them out. Incontrovertible proof of the gospel. You were saying that kind of thing a little earlier, but there's so many different lines that stack up and say this all adds up to a very persuasive picture that the gospels actually are based on eyewitness accounts. They are telling us what really did happen in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yes, and then, of course, we can think of all the characters who are named in the Gospel. So, obviously, in Luke, we have in the birth narratives, Mary, Joseph, but we have Zechariah, we have Elizabeth. Okay, they may be old, they may be off the scene by the time, certainly Zechariah and Elizabeth probably off the scene by the time Luke is writing, also mentioning Anna as quite a prophetess who's quite old, Simeon, but it's name dropping a lot of people. We have this whole group in chapter 8. You mentioned Cleopas, of course. We got Joseph of Arimathea. You've got all sorts of people, as well as the disciples who are named in there. And so, in a sense, it is. With a political biography that's naming lots of people, it gives you lots of opportunity for checking things with people.
Yes.
And particularly as Luke begins his gospel talking about the eyewitnesses that he has been exploring things with and following things with, so that Theophilus can know things with certainty. And so Theophilus is a real person, and he's saying to him, here is an abundance of people that you can go and check up with.
Yes. And if you can't check up with them, you probably check up with their children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or their nephews or whatever. There are people connected with them that you can speak to, even if they themselves are no longer around.
Yes, and then in Mark's gospel, we've got this point where Christ is carrying the cross, and it talks about Simon of Cyrene, who is coerced by the Romans to help Christ carrying the cross. And then it says about how he is the father of Alexander and Rufus, and it says nothing more. This is Mark 15, 21. And it's presupposing that whoever Mark is originally writing for know these guys. And so that's a really interesting thing, again, that makes sense if it's eyewitness record.
Yep, that's brilliant. Just very briefly, in one or two sentences, do you think the kinds of things we've been discussing in terms of internal evidence also apply to the Book of Acts?
I do think that they're there. Obviously, you can't do the comparison between the four Gospels, but there are lots and lots of those. We've already talked about how Jesus gets in trouble with the Pharisees in the Gospels. Interesting. Switch to the book of Acts. He's not in trouble with the early Christians are not in trouble with the Pharisees. They're in trouble with the Sadducees.
Yes.
And we know the Sadducees were sad, you see, because they denied the resurrection. And so that's just a real striking contrast where you've got these sort of layers.
Yeah, it's great. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter.
Sorry about that joke. No, that's so bad.
Well, I'd say we'd edit it out, but I think all the world needs to know about that. Thank you very much for joining us again on the Tyndale House podcast. Please do rate and review. It helps others to get to know about us. Pass it on to friends and colleagues. And if you have questions about these things, please do send them in to us at Tyndale House. You can find contact details on our website, tyndalehouse.com. And we'd love you to join us again for future episodes. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.